sandwich, Danny? No?
What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and I can think of nothing more appropriate at this moment than playing way too many different IndyCar games and IndyCar adjacent games because 'tis the season. And a disclaimer, this is basically going to be all the console games because it just kind of ended up working out that way. There are 3 games I'm deliberately excluding because I want to go ahead and do something with later down the road in more detail because they are that important. Those being the Papyrus games, Indy 500 The Simulation, IndyCar Racing 1, IndyCar Racing 2. So those were deliberately excluded. Microsoft's Kart Precision Racing, I just haven't had time and need to draw the line, so there's that. As well as, I'll also go ahead and mention, just before we get to that point, Project Cars 2, Forza, iRacing, R Factor 2, excluded because, yes, they have an IndyCar, but they're not IndyCar games. They're just an IndyCar plopped into a pre-existing framework, and that doesn't really count in my book. In my opinion, there's like a minimum threshold, and we have to reach there. Plus, everyone knows about those games anyways. So, let us begin. It's an Atari 2600 racer that is an enduro, and it has nothing to do with the Indy 500, despite the name. How very deceptive. This is an F1 game in the rest of the world as well as here. It just happens to have Al Unser Jr.'s name slapped on it here in the US, so moving along. Michael Andretti also got his own F1 game with his name smacked onto it here in the US. Pass. Now here is a gem of an old school top-down arcade racing piece of greatness. It's basically Super Off-Road Indy Edition, so it's got easy to pick up and play gameplay, a basic upgrade system where you can improve your car and your pit crew, sweet, awesome graphics for the time, multi-wheel steering cabinet back in the arcades. This game is just a pure fun blast at the time, and even still today, it's just a whole blast of fun, even if top-down racing games haven't aged particularly great. This is one of those games that if you like retro games, this is one definitely worth playing if you haven't already, by some chance. And it's a fun game, even for non-racing fans, that you can easily get into for some retro multiplayer action. What a name for a game. This is basically Nigel Mansell World Championship Racing, a F1 game from 2 years prior from the same studio, dropped into an IndyCar skin because Mansell Mania. Except this game came out at the tail end of a stint in kart, so not sure how much mania there was left. This one is an odd one, as I distinctly remember renting this game as a kid and being absolutely blown away by the ultra-realistic graphics, but holy moly is this game a chore to play. The car is just ludicrously fast, has nearly infinite grip, the tracks are so simplified even by period standards. It's just not a game that's held up well, and that's if it ever held up well in the first place. Now this is awesome. Going back through these games, this was one of my favorites in the whole video. Here in Al Unser Jr.'s Road to the Top, you start off with go-karts, working your way up through the somewhat primitive but effective career mode, where you'll work your way up to snowmobiles, where you will quite literally be crushed, which is just freaking hilarious in a 16-bit video game animation type of way. Then you'll move on to IROC cars, which is where the game has a massive difficulty spike, and then eventually on to Indy cars. Along the way, each category has 3 different cars which you can go ahead and choose, which all have different stats in terms of the handling, acceleration, and top speed as you'd expect from games of this era. But that isn't even the whole thing, because the game decides to double down on the whole Al Unser Jr. thing and cram in Pikes Peak, because the Unser family and Pikes Peak, those two things go together, so it makes perfectly good sense. And you have 4 different types of racing crammed into this game, and somehow, because it's got the right name on the box, it honestly feels cohesive and as if it made sense, as opposed to just like random stuff being thrown at the wall and they're just like, oh yeah, snowmobiles. You know, like Pikes Peak, Indy cars. Like, it actually works. And I'll also say, I feel like this game has to be pretty technologically advanced for the system, because I can't think of any other racing game from this era where you have these types of graphics and the ups and downs and tracks with elevation changes and all that stuff. I know there's a few of them out there, but this isn't common at all, to say the least, where, you had a crap ton of the Mode 7 racers, which were basically pole position, take 7,000, whereas this, very similar in terms of gameplay, but I think there's something much more there in terms of technologically advanced. This is a game that probably not going to blow minds today, but in my opinion, it's a top quality 16-bit racer from the era, so recommend that you play it. And finally, we get to a properly IndyCar focused game that's good and isn't from Papyrus. On one hand, Michael Andretti's IndyCar Challenge does a fairly good job of being a racing game from this era that isn't just a flat-out pedal-to-the-metal fest on the road courses, similar to the Nigel Mansell game. But on the other hand, the handling of this game is confusing enough to dampen my fun, largely because it isn't a flat-out pedal-to-the-metal fest. It's kind of weird like that, where you don't really understand what the car's doing, and it's very unpredictable in some ways. For example, on the oval tracks, it's full-on maximum arcade, where even a track like Phoenix is a 230 plus mile an hour flat-out experience, and that's just the way it is. It's kind of confusing, because on one hand, you kind of want to brake for corners and go through corners properly. On the other hand, you don't. Sometimes you want to power slide, sometimes you don't. It probably would have been categorized as realistic back in the day, but at the same time, it's not. It's just very weird. It's a very unique handling experience for games of this era, in my opinion. That isn't to say this game is bad. It's actually a solid racing game overall, and definitely the best IndyCar focused game, from the era available on the whole home consoles. But honestly, in my opinion, it's just kind of ho-hum and lacks the uniqueness and charm of Road to the Top. This game is sort of Road to the Top Sega Genesis Edition. This game features 3 distinct racing types that bring different gameplay varieties into the mix. First of all, you have sprint cars on tiny little dirt ovals that you need to drive sideways, actually counter-steering, which is really unique for this era, and actually kind of fun. You have stock cars that handle like crap and are all about drafting, because everybody knows Days of Thunder is a documentary, and everyone knows that's how stock car racing works, so that's what stock car racing has to reflect until you get into more modern times. And then lastly, you of course have Indy cars on road courses that are thinly veiled, unlicensed reproductions of real-world tracks. Mid-Ohio, for example, is like a theme park, and it's kind of fun and interesting in that sense. Honestly, the Indy cars are the least interesting cars in the game, though that's more of a testament to the other categories that don't feel like run-of-the-mill, high-grip mid-90s racing games, which is very easily the IndyCar or F1 car experience for games of this era. Overall, this is a fun game, worth playing some if you like this era of racing games, and it's definitely one that's better done than most. A Sega arcade game from the mid-90s, a racing game nonetheless. Surely it was a hit, and surely I must love it because I do love me some Sega arcade racers from the mid-90s. Not so much this one. This game came out over a year after Daytona USA came out, and it flat out looks worse. It's far less stylized and comes nowhere near close to delivering the same raw fun factor that even Daytona USA still to this day delivers. It also can't decide if it wants you to drive through the corners in a realistic fashion, slowing down for the corners, or if it wants you to power slide the corners like an arcade-style game. It falls into that weird, what's the game actually trying to get me to do, because it just feels weird in that sense. The unique quirk with the gameplay here is the slipstream, which will send your speed up to 260 miles an hour pretty much in an instant. That speed honestly feels like the whole purpose of the game in the first place, which was to, more or less, feels like, have the game with a higher top speed than the other arcade competition at the time, which is a pretty shallow existence. It's not one of the good Sega arcade racers, and there's plenty of them to choose from, so I would highly recommend you play those games instead. The second or third or whatever Andretti Racing game, this time featuring copious amounts of Texaco Havoline paid product placement advertisement between open wheel and stock cars. But let's be real, no one's going to complain about that because race cars from the 90s that were sponsored by Texaco Haviland, in all black with the big old logo on there, just a great look. You can't go wrong. But really, as a kid, the big draw here to this game was crashing cars. As an adult, that's still the case. Bits and pieces go flying in the wrecks, and it's just fun. It's one of those games where it's probably better off if you just drive backwards, because otherwise it sucks. Simple as that. The track list consists of a handful of real-world tracks that barely even loosely resemble the real tracks that they're supposed to, just partly because of the time and partly because, arcade-style racing, and tracks that are purely fictional, which often try to be a real-world track, just thinly disguised behind some really goofy, outlandish landscaping, and the Calder Park Thunderdome, which I don't know why Australia's big paved oval is in this game. I don't understand that connection. Even as a kid, I always thought, why is there a right-hand turning oval in this game? This is very weird. This is bizarre. It doesn't make sense. But it is, and that's kind of cool. So there you go. If you want to have a right-turning oval experience from a mid-90s bleh racing game, Andretti Racing is the game for you. Otherwise, skip it. This is one of those games I heard about existing and always heard that it was just not very good, and just kind of approached it that way. And after playing this game now, I'm just kind of a little baffled. But not really, because I understand why it's not very good. However, the reasons why the game is not very good and just kind of a little underwhelming are reasons that you don't usually run into with these games. So the first thing is, this is an officially licensed game for kart. However, it seems like you're missing nearly half of the kart roster and driver roster as well as the tracks. It's not half, but it's definitely north of like 33%. Let's put it that way. It's like 42.3% is what you're missing, which is just really weird. I mean, yes, I know back in the day it was very common to be missing a track or two or three or four from, officially licensed games because of licensing and the way things were working and video games and all that stuff. However, it seems like this is just, if you left out one more track, I don't know if you could really call it an officially licensed kart racing game. I don't know if that'd be fair. It's right on that borderline. But then the big issue is the graphics, because the graphics actually torpedo the whole driving aspect, because the graphics are just trying to do way too much for what the poor little PlayStation 1 could handle. There's just too many textures, there's too many polygons and things going on and shapes and all this stuff. I guess polygons are shapes, but it's just too much for the system to do, too much for the system to output, which just leads into a lot of visual clutter and it's just very messy to look at, which when you're driving makes it very difficult to be consistent because you can't tell what in the world's going on, because this is a game that is actually pretty reasonably realistic. However, because you can't see your brake marker, it's really hard. It's really hard to play the game, and it's just like fumbling around in the darkness, kind of, sort of. Like, the controls aren't bad, the handling isn't bad, but because the graphics are what they are, which are honestly pretty good in a vacuum, it causes problems downstream of that. So this game is like, you would have been better off if someone just said, hey, this is a PS1. Like, we can't put all these textures in here. People aren't going to be able to see anything. It's going to be a mess. But they didn't. This is basically the kart version of the Psygnosis Formula 1 games, Formula 1, Formula 197, which, if you've played a PlayStation 1 racing game that's not just Gran Turismo, you've probably played those games because they're a particular brand of iconic. If you played those games and enjoy them, yeah, you're going to enjoy this one as well, because it's very similar and very much in the same mold. Only this time, instead of having Murray Walker being Murray Walker, you get Bob Varsha and Danny Sullivan attempting to be just as Murray Walker as Murray Walker. And it doesn't work, but it's still fun, because you get to hear Bob Varsha ask Danny Sullivan if he'd like a sandwich in the middle of a race. Like, I don't know why, but that's a thing. Also, this game has as much official content as the official kart game that came out previously, which is just, it's just a thing. You know, that's just an extra salt in the wound on that previous game, and just like it actually builds this up, because you'd think Newman Haas Racing, well, it's just going to feature Newman Haas, but no, it doesn't. And this is another case where you can see, like, they prioritize gameplay in this one and making sure that the game played well and worked well in that sense, compared to the previous game. I'm telling you, that's where it went wrong. The previous game, Kart World Series, just tried too hard. This game didn't try hard. It just, hey, let's get Danny Sullivan and Bob Varsha in the booth to say some stupid stuff and make a racing game around it. Yeah. Also, really dig the use of the blueprint font, just gratuitously, just all over the place. Really weird in a racing game, but I dig it. Anyways. Oh hey, look it, the Sega Dreamcast makes an appearance in these videos. This game is a disappointment, and I knew that going in. And somehow I'm left even more disappointed now, having actually played the game. The features are there, the presentation is there, the full series is there, but this game feels like it was shoved out the door, and that's where it went wrong. I guess a Kart Dreamcast game was always destined to go this way, now wasn't it? The whole driving thing really torpedoes this game, despite the fact that at its core it's not super terrible. It's definitely not the worst game on this list here in this video. However, there is an issue of the default gearing has the car topping out at 150 miles an hour on road course and street course. It's pretty silly, especially when you consider, like, Road America, you're supposed to be doing 200 miles an hour 3 times a lap. That was the whole thing back in the day. But instead, you're doing 150 miles an hour down the straightaway by default, which is a massive change. However, once you get to top speed, even 150 miles an hour, the car will just go straight. Like, straight as an arrow. You cannot turn. You will have to look for the corners, because the car just will go straight, even though a champ car would definitely have been capable of doing the speeds through the corners. But that's just how the handling model is in this game. Difficulty also seems to be a complete afterthought, which leads to most of the game feeling like the standard pass all the cars from the last style affair that you'd associate more with an arcade style racing game, which doesn't seem to be what this game's aiming for, but kind of falls into where this game ends up falling into. Maybe I'm being harsh, but honestly, this game easily could have been so much better with just a little bit of time and polish and fixing some of the jank that probably should have even made it out the door in the first place, because they clearly spent time and money on this, but they clearly forgot the basics. So, yeah. Now this is the sneakiest game on this list, because this is one that I hadn't played before, and I definitely was not expecting to actually say, yeah, this game's actually pretty good. This is the first of the Indy Racing League games, and it's basically IRL from here on out. However, the big thing with this game, and what it does to make itself interesting and exciting, is it has a career mode where you'll start off in midget cars, sprint cars, formula cars, and eventually you'll make it up to the Indy Racing League. But they really took the opportunity to go ahead and turn this from a game which would have been just exclusively mash the gas button and turn to left at every now and then, into something where you have a variety of different cars and you have a variety of different tracks and presentations, which makes the game feel more full-featured and fleshed out than it otherwise would have been. The racing itself is also just bonkers, where you'll just see cars just constantly going sideways and spinning out and wrecking, and there's just carnage all over the place, but it's like the fun type of carnage where it's like, oh, like, it's one of these types of racing games where, like, there's just constantly stuff happening and I need to pay attention, as opposed to, like, I need to be absolutely laser focused on hitting the apex lap after lap type thing. My biggest gripe with this game is just the fact that it seems like the controls are really super sensitive and it's really easy to steer way too much. You have to be very smooth on that thumbstick. Part of that might be a product of using an Xbox One controller playing on an emulator here versus the N64 controller. The analog sticks definitely feel different on an original N64 controller. However, it's still definitely, I think it would feel that way even then. However, once you adapt to just like having to move the stick very little and very slowly, yeah, it handles in a typical arcade fashion. It's fun, it's enjoyable, there's a lot of stuff happening. Like, this is just a pretty decent racing game, which a lot of N64 racing games are definitely not. So, surprise, this game's actually fairly good. If you haven't heard of the movie Driven, or watched the movie Driven, please pause this video and watch that movie immediately. It will be the greatest time of your life. Make sure you come back to this video though. Anyways, if you don't know about Driven, well then there's no hope for you. Yeah, I mean, everyone knows about it by now. It's a meme for a reason. Fortunately, this game has nothing to do with the movie, although as a movie tie-in game, you know it's destined for greatness. And conveniently enough, even though it is a movie tie-in game, it has nothing to do with the movie because all the characters are in different cars, which just leads to, who in the world is Bo Brandenburg? Well, you know, like, they might as well have just picked random names out of the hat because there's like, it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. You also get the little thing that was the first thing that I noticed when I was playing this game. The cars all have grooved tires, which tells you exactly what quality of game you're looking at here, because it indicates that the people developing the game had no idea or no concept. They were just told, develop a racing game for this movie, which is going to tell you exactly the quality of game that you're playing. After all, if you can't tell the difference between the cars from Driven and an F1 car from the era, which would have had grooved tires, like, you're kind of already screwed. You're not paying very good attention because, especially at the time, they were pretty easily different. Like, you know, not an easy mistake to make if you spend more than about 10 minutes looking at it, but you know they didn't. And I spent a little bit of time talking about those tires because this game handles like absolute hot trash. This game has the most non-linear, unpredictable handling in any game I've played from like PlayStation era onwards. It is just painful to play this game. You know, some corners will be flat out and you won't even think about it as you pull like 27 G's through the corner. Whereas some corners, like, the car's just like, oh no, we gotta stop. And it's also made even worse by the fact that in the story mode, right from the start, they drop you into the fastest car in the game, more or less, capable of doing like 260 miles an hour, when other cars, the slower cars, are capable of doing like 200-ish. So you're just dumped into the deep end. Like, you need to be a meth squirrel hopped up on G Fuel to play this game, it seems like. Now, I do want to give credit where credit is due, because there are two things here about this game that I do actually legitimately like and should commend the developers of Driven for. So first of all, there is the presentation of the game and the story mode and the missions. You know, the menus all have a nice, you know, retro style vibe, you know, kind of that early 2000s retro type of vibe, if you know what I'm talking about. You know, the story is presented with comic book storyboards, and it all actually feels pretty cohesive, and it doesn't feel like they just did this because it was a cheap method to go ahead and get a product developed rather than doing cutscenes. It actually works pretty well here, and I do like it. And then there is the legitimately neat concept of getting in the zone, where you gotta drive fast, and then if you drive fast long enough, the world slows down a little bit and you get focused in and everything goes silent. This is a key plot point from the movie, which, you know, jokes aside, you know, it is a cool idea. It just unfortunately is wasted by the fact that it's in the game Driven, which is, there's no coming back from that one. Big Frosted Tips energy. That's how you describe Car Fury. This is the game that Driven, the game, should have been. Complete with launching Max Pappas to the moon repeatedly. It's just glorious. This game is basically like Hydro Thunder Kart Edition, complete with crashes galore, cars and pieces flying all over the place, turbo boosts that launch flame out the back of your tires, shortcut shenanigery. It's just as over-the-top arcade-style racing as you're going to get especially in a licensed game, and it's awesome as a pick up and play experience even still to this day. It is, yes, perhaps a bit shallow and a bit simple just by the nature of what it is, but everyone who is a fan of kart, champ car, open wheel racing, or just awesome arcade racing games should have played this game at least for a few, and hopefully you got to play it back when it's in the arcades and you got to play on the arcade cabinet. But anyways, just Kart Fury is awesome. It's underrated. Thumbs up. The next game is actually two games, but they're so similar that I'm lumping them together because they're basically the same, because that's what happens with yearly sports releases. Both of these games are simultaneously the last official IndyCar full series licensed games, and clearly the best of the bunch. Both games are in the quite solid full series game category, typical as what you'd expect from Codemasters even still to this day, where they walk a nice line between having realism and actually making the experience have some depth to it, while at the same time still remaining casual enough that it's not overbearing and overwhelming to people who aren't as into racing sims as myself or many of you guys out there. For example, beyond the typical setup adjustments where basically every game has the ability to change wing settings and all this stuff, you also get fuel mixture settings and weight jacker settings that you can adjust on track, which are things that add some realism. The handling is definitely understeer oriented and reeks of built-in stability control lurking beneath the surface, but once you start driving slower, you'll start going faster and it'll make more sense, which is what you'd expect. And I think it's really important to mention that, when you're doing a series that is oval only, which is what the Indy Racing League was at the time, it's very easy for games that don't have time and effort and detail put into them for every track to end up feeling the same because, it's oval racing with an Indy car. You just hold down the X button, you turn left. You brick the throttle and you go. That's all there is to it. But fortunately, this game is realistic enough where you do see some differences and you do start having to lift out of the throttle in the corners on some of the smaller tracks. You get an understanding of what it is, even if you don't necessarily get like a full experience that you might expect out of a more modern racing sim. There are times that the AI occasionally has issues, in particular a full started Indy with all 33 cars in the correct 11 rows of 3. It seems like they wreck more often than not in that scenario, and there's just nothing you can do about it. But once things filter out, they actually work surprisingly well and feature dynamic difficulty settings, which helps make the races actually interesting and exciting. And actually, they're pretty good in close quarters combat, which is what you'd expect and what you really need for an Indy Racing League game from this era. Honestly, in my opinion, these are just overall good racing games to begin with, whether or not you're an IndyCar fan or not. The biggest problem here that I've always had with these games is the simple fact that they are Indy Racing League games from this era, which means it's exclusively oval racing, which, as much as I love oval racing, there's only so many ways to skin the cat, especially when you're doing this type of experience. So, recommended if you haven't given it a go, at least for a game that's something different. This brings us to the last title in this video, which is Indianapolis 500 Evolution. This game is developed by Brain in a Jar, which is a fun name. They also did the previous IndyCar Series games as well. However, as far as I can tell, this game is largely a carry forward and update and tweak and all that stuff from 2007's Indianapolis 500 Legends, which was a game that was originally released exclusively for the Wii. And that's the biggest problem here. The concept of this game is a 10 out of 10 all-time great. You're dropped into 1961 in the career mode with a front-engine roadster, which comprises of a few different parts such as the chassis, engine, and transmission. From there, you race through 1971, buying the new bits and pieces as you go to plot out your own course and develop your own car and your own team. And this is such a perfect era for a racing game and such a great concept because this is the goldenest of golden ages of the Indy 500, where you see the rear engine revolution, aerodynamics become a thing, turbine engines. It's like a career mode built upon upgrading your car and buying new cars is absolutely perfect for a concept for a game. Beyond the Indy 500 and Indianapolis Motor Speedway, there's also a few historic tracks such as the Milwaukee Mile, Trenton, Riverside, and among a few others. Although this game does have a somewhat small and limited track roster, although not necessarily to be unexpected given what the series looked like back then. Executionally, though, is where this game falls apart, and probably owing to its nature and probably owing to the fact that it is a budget title. Somehow this game feels like the on-track product regressed from the previous Brain in a Jar titles. The AI here is more broken and either really slow or incredibly fast to extremes, I found. The presentation is as absolute bare bones as you could get it, besides the fact that they got Bob Jenkins to do some Bob Jenkins voice work. And then also the style of driving just doesn't work as well here. It's still got that stability control built-in type feeling from the past games. However, for a game like this, when half of the concept is just how dangerous and sketchy everything was back then, and how cutting edge some of this technology, and like a rear engine car before the rear engine cars were really figured out for this type of racing and all that stuff, like it just kind of ends up letting the game down, and it doesn't deliver on the promise of the concept. Overall, in my opinion, this game just falls flat, feeling mediocre more than anything, although it is definitely worth a look just because the concept alone is really cool. Well, that's going to do it for this video, because from here on out, we've only seen cars and stuff added into games like Project Cars 2, Forza, iRacing, and it just isn't the same type of thing. It isn't the same type of concept, so I'm not going to go ahead and talk about it. Plus, I think I've talked about enough different racing games in this video to warrant not needing to cover more racing games. But anyways, I think next month there is a small little race somewhere over in France. There was a video game I played back in the day that was pretty neato, so I want to go ahead and talk about that in the next video. So look forward to that. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. All right, bye.